In the desolate hills and quiet streets of the western frontier, ruthless band of outlaws led by a cruel and cunning leader have dominated the land for years, casting fear into every heart that beats under the sun. Their empire, built on theft, intimidation, and bloodshed, seems unshakable. But there is one man they fear, the old sheriff, long retired from the law and living in seclusion, still known for his unmatched skill with a gun. When the outlaws target him, believing him to be an easy target, they will quickly learn that some legends don't fade with time. The fastest gun in the West is not only still alive but sharper than ever. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from. If you like this story, hit that subscribe button for our YouTube channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our upcoming stories. Your support truly helps us share these hard-hitting stories with more people. The dry wind howled through the dusty streets of the small town of Hollow Creek, a place forgotten by most, where the land stretched out in all directions, barren and unforgiving. It had been years since the days when this town had been anything more than a ghost of its former self, the sound of hooves and wagon wheels long since replaced by the soft murmur of wind and time. The buildings were weathered, the wood faded and cracked by sun and rain. Only a handful of people still called Hollow Creek home. But to the riders who rode in on the winds of change, this town was ripe for plunder. The Outlaw Riders, a ruthless gang led by the notorious Cain Black Hawk, had taken control of every neighboring town, leaving chaos and violence in their wake. The land was theirs for the taking, and no man, woman, or child dared defy them. Their cruel reputation had spread across the region, and they had grown bolder with each passing day. Today, however, the riders had their eyes set on something, or rather, someone, more than just gold and riches. The old sheriff. Sheriff Samuel Sam McAllister had been a legend in these parts. Decades ago, he had been the fastest, most respected lawman west of the Mississippi. His name was known and feared by outlaws and criminals alike, and the reputation of his shooting accuracy and quick draw was nothing short of legendary. He had put down more criminal scum than any other lawman in the area before retiring to a small ranch on the outskirts of town, far from the violence and chaos he had once fought against. But even in retirement, his name lingered in the memories of every outlaw who had crossed his path. Cain Hawk had heard the stories, heard how the old sheriff had never lost a duel. And Cain wasn't one to forget a challenge. When the riders came to Hollow Creek, they didn't just come to rob. They came for revenge, and to prove a point. They would take the old sheriff down, once and for all. As the riders rode into town, Cain's eyes flickered to the small house on the outskirts, where Sam McAllister lived alone, hidden from the world. A smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. "I've heard the stories, boys," Cain said, his voice cold and dangerous. "But it's time for the old sheriff to learn that legends die hard, but they die." The riders dismounted from their horses, eyes scanning the quiet street. The wind had picked up, and it seemed like the whole town was holding its breath. Hollow Creek hadn't seen a gunfight in years, but it was about to witness one. "You think he's really as fast as they say?" One of the riders, a lanky man named Baxter, asked, his voice laced with doubt. He wiped the sweat from his brow, eyeing the house warily. Cain's gaze hardened. "Faster," he replied, his voice low and filled with certainty. "And just as deadly. But that's the point. We're going to end him tonight. I want everyone to be ready. The old man won't go down easy, but when he does, we'll make sure no one forgets who runs this land." The riders nodded grimly, their hands inching toward the grips of their revolvers. They had no illusions about the danger that lay ahead. The old sheriff wasn't some helpless old man. He had a reputation for a reason. But the riders were confident, arrogant even. They had taken down men twice as dangerous, and a legend like McAllister was no match for them. The gang made their way towards Sam McAllister's house, their boots thudding softly on the dirt road as the air grew colder, the sky darkening above them. The silence was deafening, a strange anticipation hanging in the air like a thunderstorm on the horizon. But as they approached the house, something made Cain stop. He glanced over at the others, his eyes narrowing as he caught sight of something in the distance. A figure, barely visible against the fading light of the evening. It was a man on horseback, a silhouette cutting through the dusky horizon. Cain's hand went instinctively to the handle of his gun. He wasn't afraid, not even close, but something about that figure gave him pause. The figure on horseback didn't seem to notice them at first. The man, old but still upright in the saddle, was riding toward them with a slow, steady pace. But even from this distance, Cain could see the unmistakable aura of a gunslinger. It was in the way the man sat tall in the saddle, in the easy way his hand rested near his holster, as if his gun was just an extension of himself. "Looks like we've got company," one of the riders muttered, his voice tense. Cain's lips curled into a wicked smile. "Just a shadow in the dust, boys," he said coldly. "But it's time we see if the stories about the old sheriff are true." The man on horseback, Sheriff Samuel McAllister, was finally approaching. The tension in the air thickened, and the riders knew that in just moments, they would come face to face with the fastest gun in the West. Cain stood tall, his eyes locked onto McAllister, the first real challenge they had faced in years. And as the wind howled and the shadows stretched long across the town, the showdown between legend and outlaw was about to begin. The sun had long dipped behind the hills, leaving Hollow Creek bathed in the dim light of twilight. The air was thick with dust and the scent of imminent violence, a quiet, electric buzz of anticipation that seemed to vibrate in the very ground beneath the feet of the outlaw riders. Sheriff Samuel McAllister rode slowly, deliberately, toward the group of riders standing in the middle of the street. His horse, a sturdy bay mare named Patches, moved with the ease of an animal who knew the way as well as the man atop her. Sam's hands rested casually on the reins, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the faces of the men who had come to kill him. He had heard the galloping hooves long before they had reached Hollow Creek, the sound of their arrival no surprise. McAllister wasn't naive. He knew the outlaw riders had been terrorizing the land for months now, leaving a trail of death and destruction. He knew they'd eventually come for him, the old lawman who had once stood as the last bastion of justice in a world gone cold. But tonight wasn't about justice. It wasn't about stopping them from plundering, from killing. This was personal. Cain Hawk, the leader of the riders, had come for him. And when a man like Cain Hawk called your name, you had to answer. The wind whispered across the empty street, carrying the scent of dust and dry grass. But there was something else on the air now, something thick with tension. The gang didn't move as McAllister drew closer, their eyes locking with his as they prepared for the inevitable. The outlaw gang was confident, even arrogant. They had never faced anything like him before, but they had no idea what was coming. They had no idea what they were up against. McAllister's reputation preceded him. The stories about the old sheriff were legendary. How his hand was faster than the draw of a lightning strike. How he had sent more men to their graves than any man alive. No outlaw had ever survived a duel with him. Not one. And no one had dared challenge him since he'd retired from the law all those years ago. But Cain Hawk was different. Cain wasn't afraid of legends. He had built his empire through fear, and he had no intention of letting the old sheriff stand in his way. Tonight, Cain was going to prove a point. McAllister's name, his legend, would be erased. The riders stood in a loose circle, their hands hovering near their guns, waiting for the moment to strike. But McAllister didn't hurry. He never did. He let the silence hang heavy, each passing second stretching the tension between them. Finally, McAllister spoke, his voice low, almost reverent in its calm. "Cain Hawk," he said, his gaze narrowing as he focused on the man who stood at the front of the riders. "I've heard your name more times than I care to count, but you've made a mistake tonight. You've come after the wrong man." Cain's lips curled into a smile, a grin that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. "You're still here, huh, old man? I thought you'd be hiding in some hole by now, too scared to show your face. But I guess you've got more pride than sense." McAllister's hand never left the reins. He didn't respond to Cain's taunts, his focus never wavering. He had no intention of engaging in a war of words. This was a duel, plain and simple. It had always been a duel, and it always would be. It was about skill, about speed. The only thing that mattered was who was faster. Another rider, a scrappy-looking man named Lenny, broke the silence with a low chuckle. "You really think you can beat us all, old man? We've got the numbers. And we've got Cain." McAllister's gaze flickered briefly to Lenny before returning to Cain. He didn't care about the numbers. He had faced worse odds before. Numbers don't matter, he said. Not when you're facing a man who can't be beat. Cain's smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. We'll see about that, he growled, stepping forward. His hand hovered near his holster, fingers flexing in anticipation. McAllister remained still, his gaze unblinking. He had always been a man of few words, and his reputation had been built on the sheer presence he commanded with nothing more than his steady composure. He didn't need to speak. The air around him did the talking. The tension, the silence, it all spoke for him. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The riders shifted slightly, their hands twitching toward their guns, and McAllister's fingers twitched just as subtly, inching closer to the cold steel of his revolver. It was an old, well-worn weapon, its handle smooth from years of use, but still as deadly as the day it was forged. And then, the silence shattered. Cain's gun was the first to move, his hand snapping down to draw faster than the eye could follow. But it was too slow. McAllister had already moved, his body a blur of motion, his own hand drawing with the precision of a man who had done this 1,000 times before. The first shot rang out, loud, sharp, and cutting through the night like a thunderclap. Cain's revolver had barely cleared his holster when McAllister's bullet struck, hitting the gun in Cain's hand and sending it flying into the air. The riders gasped, their eyes wide in disbelief as they watched the gun spin away, landing several feet behind Cain. The old sheriff hadn't just disarmed him. He had rendered him helpless in an instant. The riders stood frozen, unsure of what to do. They had seen McAllister's legend in the stories, but they never imagined the reality would be so quick, so effortless. Cain stumbled back, his hand clutching his empty holster, his face twisted in rage. "You're faster than I thought, old man. But it doesn't matter," he snarled, his voice dripping with venom. "I've got plenty more where that came from." McAllister's eyes flickered to the fallen gun, his expression unchanged. "You may have numbers, Cain, but you'll never have skill. You've already lost." And with that, the stage was set. The fastest gun in the West had just made his move, and the riders were about to find out exactly what that meant. The silence in Hollow Creek seemed to stretch, suspended in time, as the riders stood frozen. Cain Hawk's revolver lay a few feet away, discarded on the ground, its once proud barrel now just another victim of the old sheriff's precision. The riders' eyes flicked nervously between their leader and the figure on horseback, McAllister, whose gun was still at his side, steady and unmoving. Cain's face twisted in a mixture of disbelief and fury. He hadn't expected it to end like this. Not in the blink of an eye, not in the span of a heartbeat. He was the leader of the riders, feared across the region, and yet here he stood, disarmed, humiliated by a man who had long since retired from the law. For a long moment, no one moved. The riders stared at McAllister, their hands twitching toward their holsters, but none of them dared to make the first move. They knew that if they did, they would die before they could even draw their guns. McAllister's eyes never wavered from Cain's. The old sheriff was calm, too calm, as if he were waiting for them to make their move, as if the outcome of this confrontation had already been decided long before they even arrived in Hollow Creek. Cain's voice broke the silence, hoarse with anger. "You think you can take me down like that? You're just an old man playing at being a hero. You're nothing but a ghost of the past." McAllister didn't flinch. "You came here looking for a fight, Cain, but you didn't come prepared to lose." His words rang in the air like a challenge, and the tension in the street became palpable. The riders' hands twitched again, but no one dared to make the first move. Cain's eyes shifted from McAllister to his men, then back to the sheriff, his fists clenching at his sides. He was used to intimidating people, used to being the one who made others flinch in fear. But here, in this town, with this man, Cain could feel something he hadn't felt in a long time: fear. For all of his bravado, Cain knew he had underestimated McAllister. The old sheriff was no longer just a name whispered in legends. He was right here in front of him, a living, breathing reminder of the cost of underestimating the past. Cain took a step back, his voice low, measured. "Get him." The command was all it took. The riders reached for their guns in unison, but McAllister was already moving. The speed with which he drew his revolver was nothing short of lethal. Before any of the riders could even react, McAllister's gun barked twice in quick succession, and 2 men dropped to the ground, their bodies jerking violently as the bullets struck their targets. The first man, a tall, lanky rider named Greg, fell with a scream, clutching at his chest as the life drained from him. The second, a hulking brute named Jeb, barely had time to register the pain before he collapsed face first into the dirt, his gun still in his hand. The remaining riders hesitated, caught between the pull of instinct and the brutal reality that had just been set before them. Cain's face contorted in rage, his eyes wide with disbelief. "You're faster than I thought," he spat, his voice venomous. "But you won't win. Not today." McAllister didn't respond, his expression unchanged as he reholstered his gun with a smooth, practiced motion. His eyes scanned the remaining riders, his gaze cold and unforgiving. "You're out of your league," he said simply. The riders didn't move. They could feel the weight of McAllister's words in their bones. His presence was like a storm on the horizon, unavoidable, inevitable. They had come to kill the legend, but now they could only watch as the legend stood before them, unwavering. Cain's lip curled into a snarl, his hand hovering over the handle of his own gun. The old man was too fast, too skilled, but Cain still had something to prove. He wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not after all of this. "Move in. Don't let him get the best of you," Cain shouted, his voice sharp with desperation. The riders hesitated for a moment longer, uncertainty clouding their faces. But finally, they acted. They moved in unison, their guns drawn, ready to take down the man who had once been the terror of the West. McAllister's eyes narrowed. He was already moving before they had fully drawn their guns. His left hand snapped out, gripping the reins, and his horse surged forward, carrying him toward the riders with a speed that took them by surprise. As he moved, his revolver was already clearing the holster. The riders tried to react, but McAllister was faster. The first man, a young rider named Danny, never had a chance. McAllister's bullet hit him square in the chest, knocking him backward into the dust. The force of the shot made the sound of his fall seem like thunder, the finality of it hanging in the air. The second rider, a burly man named Roy, attempted to raise his gun, but McAllister was already on top of him. The old sheriff's gun flashed again, and Roy's weapon flew from his hand as the bullet struck his wrist. He screamed, falling to the ground, clutching his arm in agony. Cain stood motionless, watching as his gang fell apart before his very eyes. McAllister was a force of nature, calm, precise, unstoppable. There was no fighting this. Cain's mouth went dry as he watched the riders retreat, but it was too late. The damage had been done. McAllister didn't stop. He wasn't here to show mercy. He was here to end this. With a few more calculated moves, he took down the remaining men in seconds, the air around him filled with the deafening sounds of gunfire. The last rider, a quiet man named Ezra, fell to the ground in a heap, his gun clattering uselessly beside him. McAllister stood over him, his expression unchanging, his revolver still smoking in his hand. Cain was the only one left standing. His gun was drawn now, his face twisted in a grimace of determination. "You think you've won?" he shouted, his voice shaking with fury. "You think this is over?" McAllister slowly holstered his revolver, the motion deliberate, each movement controlled. "It's over for you," he replied quietly, his voice as cold as the steel of his gun. Cain's hand tightened around the grip of his revolver, his knuckles white. "You'll regret this," he snarled, but McAllister's eyes were already on him, steady and unwavering. There was no more fight left in Cain. He had seen enough, and in that moment, he knew he had been bested. The old sheriff had brought his empire to its knees in the span of a few moments. With a final, defeated breath, Cain dropped his gun, the cold reality of his defeat sinking in. The wind still howled through the empty streets of Hollow Creek, the dust swirling in the aftermath of the quick, brutal fight that had unfolded moments before. Sheriff Samuel McAllister stood over the fallen bodies of the outlaw riders, his eyes scanning the street with a calculated calm, as if he were merely assessing a job well done. The last of the riders had been dealt with, and now only Cain Hawk remained, standing alone in the middle of the street, his revolver limp in his hand. Cain's breath was ragged, his chest rising and falling rapidly as he stared at the old sheriff, his face pale with a mix of disbelief and seething anger. He had come to Hollow Creek to prove that no one, not even a legend like McAllister, could stand in the way of his empire. But now, it was clear that everything he had built, his empire, his power, his men, had crumbled in the blink of an eye. McAllister's gaze was steady, unwavering. His hand rested near the grip of his revolver, but he showed no immediate sign of action. He had done what needed to be done. The riders were defeated, and Cain had been humbled. But Cain wasn't finished yet. He had been knocked down, but he wasn't ready to admit defeat. Not yet. You think this is over, don't you? Cain spat, his voice hoarse from the dust and anger. You think you've won, but you haven't. You haven't seen what's coming. My empire won't fall because of you. I'll burn this town to the ground, and there's nothing you can do to stop me. McAllister remained silent, his eyes fixed on Cain. There was no need for words now. The riders were finished, and the power Cain had once wielded was nothing more than a fleeting illusion. His empire had crumbled, not just because of McAllister's speed or precision, but because of his own arrogance and greed. He had thought he could defeat the past, destroy the legend of the old sheriff, but in doing so, he had underestimated the one thing that had always made McAllister unbeatable: his patience. Cain's hand trembled as he raised the revolver again, his finger twitching near the trigger. He could feel the heat of the gun's metal, could almost taste the sweat on his brow. He knew that if he shot McAllister now, it would be the end of him. But what choice did he have left? You won't win, McAllister said finally, his voice low and firm, carrying the weight of someone who had already seen the outcome. This town has seen enough death. You can leave. And if you're smart, you'll stay gone. Cain's lips curled into a twisted grin, his anger mingling with desperation. You think I'll walk away? You think you've won? The riders may be dead, but my empire's just beginning. You can't stop what's already set in motion. McAllister's face softened slightly, but his eyes remained hard. Your empire was built on fear, Cain, and fear never lasts. It fades, and when it fades, all that's left is ruin. That's all you've got left. Ruin. The words hit Cain harder than any bullet could. His expression faltered for a brief moment as the truth of them settled in. His grip on the gun tightened, his knuckles white against the cold metal. He had spent so many years building his empire, taking what he wanted, leaving destruction in his wake. But now, in this moment, he saw it for what it truly was: fragile, hollow, and destined to collapse. He had been blinded by his own ambition, by the thirst for power. And now, with the bodies of his men scattered across the street and the remnants of his empire lying in ruins, Cain realized that McAllister had already won, without ever firing a single shot. But Cain wasn't ready to admit defeat. Not yet. Not when there was still one final, desperate chance to reclaim some of what he had lost. He raised his revolver again, aiming it directly at McAllister. His finger hovered near the trigger, trembling with uncertainty. For a moment, it seemed as if he might pull the trigger, as if the final showdown would come down to a last desperate attempt. But McAllister never flinched. He stood tall, unmoving, his eyes locked on Cain's, waiting. Cain's pulse raced in his ears. He could feel the heat of the gun in his hand, could hear the faint sound of his heartbeat drowning out everything else. He was about to make his final move, but then something stopped him. It was the look in McAllister's eyes, the quiet resolve, the calm certainty that everything had already been decided. The old sheriff wasn't afraid. He wasn't threatened. He knew Cain had no chance, and it was in that knowledge that Cain's hand faltered. He couldn't pull the trigger. He couldn't fight against the inevitable. The revolver dropped from Cain's hand with a dull thud as the weight of his defeat finally sank in. His chest heaved, and for the first time, he felt the weight of all the lives he had destroyed, all the power he had stolen, and all the lies he had told. The empire he had built was nothing but a crumbling house of cards, and McAllister had shown him the truth of that. Cain's knees buckled beneath him, and he sank to the ground, the weight of his defeat too much to bear. He had thought he could stand up to the old sheriff, thought he could crush the legend. But in the end, it was McAllister who had crushed him, just as he had crushed countless others before him, with a quiet and deadly precision. McAllister didn't move. He didn't need to. He had already won. The town of Hollow Creek was silent, save for the faint wind that carried the scent of dust and the echo of a long-forgotten legend that had returned to right the wrongs of the world. McAllister stood tall, a figure carved from the past, his legacy intact. And as the last remnants of Cain Hawk's empire crumbled before him, the old sheriff simply turned and rode off into the fading light of the horizon. The wind whispered across the empty streets of Hollow Creek, carrying with it the bitter scent of dust and death. The fading light of the evening cast long shadows, stretching over the bodies of the fallen riders, the twisted remnants of Cain Hawk's once feared empire. In the distance, the steady clip-clop of McAllister's horse, Patches, was the only sound that broke the heavy silence. McAllister didn't look back. He had done what needed to be done, and now it was over. The riders were gone, their threat extinguished, and their leader, Cain Hawk, was broken, kneeling in the dirt, the last remnants of his arrogance crushed under the weight of his defeat. The old sheriff's reputation had not been a myth, nor had it been exaggerated. He had lived up to every story, every whispered tale of his speed and accuracy. But even more than that, it was his calm demeanor, his refusal to be swayed by threats or bribes, that made him a force to be reckoned with. McAllister had not just defeated Cain Hawk. He had shown the riders, and the world, that some things were not meant to be taken, and some men could never be broken. As McAllister rode away from the desolate street, the faces of the riders' victims, those who had died at Cain's hand in the years before, seemed to flicker in his mind. He had spent much of his life fighting for justice, and though he had walked away from the law years ago, he couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. But there was something else, something he hadn't expected, a deep, unshakable weariness. The old sheriff had always lived by a certain code, one that had kept him fighting for what was right, no matter the cost. But now, as he rode through the quiet, empty land, the weight of his past seemed to settle over him. The days of gunfights, of chasing down outlaws, of putting things right in a world that seemed to have forgotten what justice truly meant, were behind him. He had no desire to return to the law, but even in retirement, it seemed that his past would always come calling when the world needed him most. McAllister's mind was still sharp, still quick, but the years had taken their toll. The battles, the years of riding hard and living with the constant weight of responsibility, had left him with little to show for it except the fading echoes of victories long past. He had given so much of himself to this life, to the fight against the darkness that gripped the land, and now, the land had given him nothing in return but silence. He rode on, his gaze scanning the horizon. There was no real home waiting for him. The small ranch he had once settled into on the outskirts of Hollow Creek had long since become nothing more than a quiet, lonely place, one he had retreated to in search of peace. But even there, he knew, peace was fleeting. Men like Cain Hawk didn't stop coming, and legends like McAllister were always needed. But McAllister wasn't sure how much longer he could answer the call. The sounds of the world around him, birds calling, the wind howling, the crunch of hooves on dirt, seemed distant now, as if he were walking through a dream. Hollow Creek had been his last stand, his last time in the saddle, and he could feel it in the deep recesses of his bones. The years had finally caught up with him. The old sheriff, for all his skill and reputation, was no longer the man he had once been. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with fiery hues of orange and red, McAllister guided Patches toward his small, weathered cabin on the outskirts of town. The ranch that had once been a place of solace now stood as a quiet reminder of a life lived too hard, too fast. He had built the small home for peace, for solitude, but it had never brought him either. He had never truly been alone, not in his heart, not in his mind. As McAllister dismounted and tied Patches to the post, he heard a noise, a faint rustling, like the whisper of footsteps on dry grass. He turned sharply, his instincts kicking in despite the weight of his years. It wasn't a rider. No, this was something else. A figure emerged from the shadows of the trees, tall and angular, their steps slow and deliberate. The wind shifted, and McAllister caught the faint scent of gunpowder in the air. His hand instinctively moved to his holster, but he stopped himself. He wasn't ready for another fight. Not now. Not after everything. The figure stepped forward, revealing themselves under the dim light of the setting sun. It was a woman. Her face was obscured by the wide brim of a dusty hat, and she wore the faded, patched-up clothes of someone who had been riding for a long time. McAllister's gaze flickered over her quickly, his mind calculating. She wasn't a threat. Not yet. But something about her presence made him pause. Sheriff McAllister? Her voice was rough, dry like it hadn't been used in days, but there was a strange determination behind it. She wasn't just looking for a place to stay. She was looking for something else. He didn't respond immediately, eyeing her warily as she approached. She didn't seem to be in a hurry, though she had the look of someone who had seen a fair share of hard roads. "I need your help," she said simply, her voice steady now that she was closer. "I've heard the stories. You're the one who can stop them." McAllister's brow furrowed. "Stop who?" The woman's eyes narrowed. "The men who've taken everything. They're worse than Hawk, and they won't stop until everyone's gone. They've already moved on from Cain. They'll come for you next." McAllister studied her for a moment, his eyes flicking back to his small cabin, then to the dusty horizon behind her. He could feel the old, familiar tug of duty, of the responsibility he had carried for so many years. It was a weight he had tried to leave behind. But the truth was, it never truly left. The woman took another step forward. "You're the only one who can stop them. I'm not asking for a fight, but we both know you can't walk away forever." McAllister exhaled slowly, his shoulders slumping slightly under the weight of her words. He had known, deep down, that the fight wasn't over. He had thought Cain Hawk's death would be the last time he'd have to draw his gun. But now, as he looked into the woman's eyes, he saw something else. Something darker. Something that told him the peace he had sought was never meant to be. McAllister stood still for a long moment, his eyes studying the woman before him. The fading light of the sun cast long shadows across the ground, stretching across his small cabin, and for the first time in years, he felt a sense of heaviness settle over him that he couldn't shake. It was as if the land itself was whispering to him, telling him that his time of peace was over, that the world still needed him, and more importantly, that the world wasn't finished with him yet. The woman, sensing his hesitation, spoke again, her voice urgent but calm. "I'm not here to make trouble. I know what you've done, Sheriff. The stories, they're true. The riders you just took care of, they were just a small part of something bigger, something far worse." McAllister's hand twitched toward his holster again, but he forced himself to still. The familiar weight of the revolver was a reminder of everything he had left behind, but it also reminded him of the life he had once lived, a life where he fought for the right reasons, for justice. He hadn't thought about that kind of life in years, but hearing the woman's words stirred something inside him. The land, the old life, was calling him back. "Bigger?" he repeated, his voice gruff, his gaze still hard. "What do you mean by bigger?" The woman's eyes darted toward the distance, toward the horizon where the last rays of sunlight kissed the land. She looked tense, as if she were listening for something. Finally, she met McAllister's gaze again. "There's a new gang," she said softly, but there was an unmistakable edge of fear in her voice. "They've been hunting people like me, people who resist, and they've taken control of everything in the next town over. I've seen what they do. It's not like the riders. These men, they've got something darker. They've got a plan, and it's bigger than anything you've ever faced." McAllister's jaw tightened at the mention of the riders. He had spent his years chasing down men like Cain Hawk, criminals who had no real purpose but to bring destruction to the world. But this was different. The fire in the woman's eyes told him that whatever this new gang was, it wasn't something he could ignore. "You've seen them," McAllister said, his voice a low rasp. "And you think I can stop them?" The woman nodded, her face serious. "I know you can. You're the only one left who has the skills to do it. But it won't be easy. They're organized. They're ruthless. And they've already started making their move. McAllister's mind raced as he absorbed her words. His body was tired, his bones aching from years of hard work and even harder fights. He had walked away from the life of a sheriff because he had believed it was over. The land had changed, and so had the men who lived on it. But now, hearing this woman's words, he felt the old fire stir within him, a fire he thought he had left behind. "You don't know who you're dealing with," he said quietly, his voice tinged with a mix of resignation and resolve. "There's always another gang, another outlaw, another battle to fight. And I'm not sure I'm the man I used to be." The woman stepped closer, her eyes fierce. "I know you're tired. I know you fought for too long. But there's no one else. Not now. The people in that town, people like me, don't have a chance unless you help us." McAllister looked away, his eyes scanning the landscape around him. His ranch, his small haven, felt like a lifetime ago. The quiet had always been a relief, but now it felt suffocating. The old man's heart, still strong despite the years, began to beat with the familiar rhythm of a man who had long ago sworn to protect the weak and punish the wicked. The call to action, the weight of responsibility, was impossible to ignore. He let out a long sigh, his shoulders slumping as he turned back to the woman. "What makes you think I can still stop them? I'm just one man." Her eyes softened, but there was no hesitation in her voice. "Because you're the only one who's ever stood up to men like them. You don't have to do it alone. There are still people out there who believe in justice, who need a leader. They're waiting for someone to show them the way." McAllister's mind raced again, his thoughts flashing back to the many years he had spent fighting in the dust and blood of the West. He had seen it all. Men who thought they could conquer the world with violence, but who ultimately failed. And he had always been the one to put them down. He had been the one who restored order, no matter the cost. But now, after all these years, he wasn't sure if the world still had room for men like him. The gunfights, the endless struggle for control, had worn him down. The weight of leadership had broken him once, and he wasn't sure he could bear it again. But as he stood there, listening to the wind stir the trees and the faint sound of the woman's footsteps in the dirt, something inside him began to shift. The world wasn't finished with him, and he wasn't finished either. McAllister drew a long breath, the cool air filling his lungs. He reached for the revolver at his side, his hand closing around the familiar handle with a firmness that surprised even him. The weight of it, the cool steel, reminded him of who he was, the man who had once been the fastest gun in the West. "I can't promise you anything," he said, his voice steady now, the old authority creeping back into his words. "But I'll ride with you. We'll see if this new gang is as bad as you say." The woman's face softened with relief. She stepped back slightly, her hand resting on the saddle of her horse. "Thank you, Sheriff. You don't know what this means to us." McAllister gave a small nod, his eyes hardening once more as he turned toward the horizon. "I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing this because someone has to stand up and stop them. And if I don't, there won't be anyone left to fight." With that, he mounted his horse, the sound of hooves echoing as the two of them rode off into the fading light. The old sheriff had returned to the road, and the world would soon feel the weight of his judgment once more. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a silvery glow over the arid landscape as McAllister and the woman rode side by side, their horses' hooves kicking up the dust of the trail ahead. The land stretched out before them, empty and unforgiving, but McAllister felt the familiar tension in his shoulders, the one that always came before a fight. The old sheriff had been away from the saddle for years, but it seemed that the call to duty was something that never truly left you. It just waited, quietly, for the right moment. His companion was silent for a while, as if sensing that the old sheriff needed time to adjust, to reflect. She had introduced herself as Rachel, a rancher's daughter from the nearby town of Ravens Hollow. Her voice had held a quiet strength when she spoke, but it was clear that she was just as worn by the years of turmoil as McAllister. The riders had been bad enough, but this new gang, the one she had warned him about, sounded like something worse. The weight of his decision to help her, to help the people of Ravens Hollow, sat heavily on his chest. He had fought too many battles, lost too many friends, and buried too many enemies to know that the next fight would not be easy. Cain Hawk's riders were nothing compared to the men they were about to face. "Tell me about this gang," McAllister said after a while, his voice rough from the dust in the air. "Who are they? What's their deal?" Rachel glanced over at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "They're called the Blackstone Marauders," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her words. "They're worse than any gang I've seen. They've got numbers, McAllister. And worse, they've got something that no one else has. They've got the backing of the railroad companies, the landowners, and they're working with corrupt officials, people in power. They've come for everything, the land, the cattle, the people. They've already begun clearing out entire towns." McAllister's expression darkened, his eyes narrowing as he listened. "So, they're not just a gang. They've got money, influence." Rachel nodded grimly. "They've been making their move for months. They come into towns, take what they want, and leave nothing behind but ruin. The local lawmen can't stand up to them. They've been bought off or threatened into submission. People are scared. They've heard the stories, but no one's been able to do anything about it." McAllister's jaw clenched. This wasn't just about outlaws anymore. This wasn't about men who stole cattle or robbed trains. This was about a corrupt system that had taken root in the very foundation of the land. These marauders weren't just criminals. They were a force, one that had woven itself into the fabric of the West, and that made them all the more dangerous. Rachel's voice broke through his thoughts. "I've seen what they do to people who resist, to families who stand up to them. They leave them dead or broken." McAllister didn't say anything for a long time. The moonlight caught the edges of his worn hat as he looked ahead, his mind turning over the pieces of the puzzle she had presented. Corrupt officials, railroad companies, landowners who didn't care for the little people, as long as they could profit from the misery. What do they want? McAllister finally asked. "Why come after Raven's Hollow? It's just a small town." Rachel looked over at him, her eyes hardening. "It's not just Raven's Hollow, Sheriff. It's all of us. They're clearing out the small towns so they can build their railroads and take control of the land. They're looking to build an empire of their own, and they'll kill anyone who stands in their way." McAllister took in her words slowly. His hand rested on the pommel of his saddle, his fingers brushing the worn leather, feeling the familiar grip of the reins. He had once fought for the law, but now, this wasn't just about the law. It was about something bigger, something more important. He looked over at Rachel. "You're right. This is bigger than just a gang. This is about the land, about the future of everything we've worked for. And I won't let them take it." Rachel's face softened, and for the first time, McAllister saw the burden she carried. "I knew you'd understand, Sheriff. You're the only one who can stop them." McAllister didn't answer immediately. His mind was already racing through strategies, recalling old tactics and methods of dealing with gangs like this. But the truth was, this was different. He wasn't just facing a gang of outlaws now. He was facing a force that had power, that could destroy entire towns without so much as a second thought. It would take more than just his quick draw to stop them. But he had faced worse odds before. And the people of Raven's Hollow didn't deserve to be crushed under the weight of tyranny, no matter how powerful the men behind it were. "You'll have the help you need," McAllister said finally, his voice low and steady. "But this fight won't be easy. We'll need to be smarter, faster, and we'll need to find allies. We can't do it alone." Rachel nodded. "I've already spoken to a few people. The local farmers, ranchers, some of the lawmen who still have their backs against the wall. They're ready to fight." McAllister's lips tightened into a thin line. "Good. But we'll need more. We'll need to hit them where it hurts. If we're going to stop them, we need to take out their supply lines, their power sources. We have to show them we're not afraid." Rachel's eyes glinted with a new resolve. "I'll rally the people. I'll make sure they're ready." McAllister turned his horse, looking back toward the town in the distance, feeling the weight of what lay ahead. It wasn't just about fighting back. It was about showing the world that no one, not even the corrupt powers of the railroad or the marauders, could take the land and the people who belonged to it. They rode into the night, knowing that what awaited them was the biggest fight of their lives. The next morning, Hollow Creek lay in the quiet stillness that followed a storm. The wind had shifted, leaving the land feeling heavy, like the calm before another wave of destruction. McAllister and Rachel had spent the night preparing, gathering what information they could, and rallying the few who were brave enough to stand with them. The Marauders had already made their presence felt in the surrounding area, and it was clear that if they were to stand a chance, the people of Raven's Hollow, and any who would join them, needed to come together. McAllister stood outside his cabin, his eyes scanning the horizon. The rolling hills and barren plains stretched out before him, the vast emptiness a reminder of how much was at stake. It wasn't just a town anymore. It was the soul of the West, the last bastion of freedom, and the old sheriff knew that it was up to him and the people who still believed in justice to protect it. Rachel had gone into town to gather the last of the fighters, the ones who had hesitated but were now ready to take a stand. The town had seen too much bloodshed in the past few years, and many had been too afraid to resist. But the Marauders weren't just robbers. They were an army, and it would take more than McAllister and a few good men to fight them. McAllister turned as he heard the faint sound of hooves approaching. Rachel rode into view, leading a small group of men and women who looked like they had just been pulled from their everyday lives. Their faces were lined with fear and uncertainty, but there was something else in their eyes, determination, a spark of something that had been buried for too long. Rachel's horse slowed as she rode up to McAllister. "We've got them," she said, her voice steady despite the weight of what they were about to face. "The farmers, the ranchers, a few lawmen who've been hiding out. They're ready to fight." McAllister nodded slowly, his eyes moving over the ragtag group of fighters behind her. It wasn't a large group, maybe a dozen at most, but they had the one thing that Cain Hawk's riders had lacked: resolve. The Marauders might have the power, the numbers, and the backing of the wealthy landowners and railroad magnates, but they didn't have the heart that these people did. And heart, McAllister knew, could carry a man further than anything else when the stakes were high enough. "We can't take them head-on with this many," McAllister said, his voice low as he eyed the group. "But we don't need to. We need to be smart. We'll hit their supply lines, cut them off from their resources. We find out where they're getting their supplies, and we make sure they don't get any more." Rachel's brow furrowed. "But how do we find them? They've been careful about hiding their movements." "We find someone who knows the land," McAllister said, his mind already turning over the options. "There's an old contact of mine, a tracker. He lives a few days' ride from here. He knows the Marauders' movements. If we can get to him, he'll help us pinpoint where the Marauders are getting their supplies." Rachel nodded, her face hardening with resolve. "I'll get a group together and head out first thing in the morning. If we can find their supplies, we can start cutting them off from the inside." McAllister looked over the group again, his heart heavy with the weight of what he was about to ask. These weren't trained soldiers. They weren't even trained fighters. They were just regular people who had been pushed to the edge, people who had been living in fear for too long. "They're going to come for us, Rachel," McAllister said, his voice grave, "and they'll come hard. The Marauders don't take kindly to resistance." She met his gaze, her eyes fierce. "I know, but we can't back down. Not anymore." McAllister felt a pang in his chest, a flicker of something that had been buried deep for years. This wasn't the life he had wanted, the life he had dreamed of after he retired from being sheriff. He had wanted peace, solitude. But the world didn't work that way. The fight had always been there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to rise again. The sound of boots crunching against the dirt drew McAllister's attention back to the group. A few of the men who had volunteered for the mission were gathering around Rachel, eager but wary. They weren't soldiers, but they were willing to fight, and that was what counted. "We leave at first light," McAllister said, his voice firm. "We move quickly, and we don't stop until we get the information we need. I'll stay behind and gather more intel, but you all need to stay sharp. If the Marauders come for us before we're ready, we'll need to scatter. We can't let them know our plans." The group nodded, the weight of McAllister's words sinking in. There was no glory in this, no victory yet, but there was a chance, a slim one, that they could make it out of this alive. Rachel's voice broke the silence. "We'll do whatever it takes. For Raven's Hollow. For the people." McAllister met her eyes again, his expression hard. That's the only way this works. We fight, or we die. No halfway. The group fell into a quiet determination. There was no question in their minds now. They would fight, and they would fight to win. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the old sheriff mounted his horse once more, feeling the familiar weight of the saddle beneath him. He had fought many battles in his life, but this one felt different. It wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight for everything. The land, the people, the very idea of freedom. And this time, the fight wasn't just his. It was theirs. The night was cool and clear, the stars burning bright above as McAllister sat quietly in front of the small campfire, watching the flames crackle and dance. The scent of wood smoke filled the air, mingling with the dry, dusty scent of the land that stretched out around them like a vast ocean. They had set up camp on the outskirts of Hollow Creek, just beyond the town's edge, where the first rays of sunlight would soon break across the hills. Rachel and the others had made their preparations, packing their gear and preparing to set out at first light. McAllister had given his orders, strict and clear. They would ride hard, keeping to the back roads and hidden trails where they were less likely to be spotted by the Marauders' scouts. The ride would take them a few days, but McAllister knew it would be worth it. If they could find the Marauders' supply lines, they could cripple their operation before it even began. The old sheriff's thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of footsteps approaching from behind. He turned just as Rachel appeared, her face drawn and tired but resolute. "You should get some rest, Sheriff," she said quietly, standing a few paces from him. "We'll need you at full strength in the morning." McAllister didn't answer immediately. He just stared into the fire, his fingers tracing the worn grip of his revolver. The weight of the decision to ride back into the heart of the conflict, to face the danger head-on, pressed heavily on his mind. He had retired from this life years ago. The last thing he had wanted was to be pulled back into the chaos, but Rachel's words had stirred something deep within him. He hadn't felt this alive in years. "Rest doesn't come easy," McAllister replied after a long pause, his voice gravelly. "Not when you know what's waiting for you." Rachel nodded, understanding. "I know," she said softly, sitting beside him, "but we can't keep going if we don't take care of ourselves. The journey's hard enough. We need to be prepared for whatever's coming." McAllister finally looked at her, his eyes scanning her face as if trying to read the hidden truth there. Rachel was young, with fire in her eyes and a determination that reminded him of his own younger self. But there was something else there, something deeper. A weariness that had crept into her that only time in this unforgiving land could produce. "You're not just fighting for Raven's Hollow," McAllister said, his voice quiet, almost reflective. "You're fighting for something bigger than that." Rachel didn't say anything for a moment, her eyes flickering to the campfire before meeting his again. "I guess we all are," she said simply, a slight tremble in her voice. "The Marauders won't stop with us. They'll just keep going. They'll take everything. And if we don't stand now, when will we?" McAllister's face softened, his eyes flicking to the horizon. He could hear the wind rustling through the trees, and the stillness of the night seemed to press on him. For the first time in a long time, he felt the weight of the world on his shoulders, but it didn't feel as heavy as it once had. It was the feeling of being needed, of having a purpose again. "You're right," he said finally, his voice steady. "But this won't be easy. The Marauders won't go down without a fight. They're organized, ruthless, and we're outnumbered." Rachel's jaw tightened, her resolve hardening. "Then we make sure they know what they're up against. They've been doing this long enough. They think they own this land, but they don't. We're not backing down." McAllister nodded slowly. He could feel the old fire beginning to stir within him. It had been years since he had fought for something like this, something worth fighting for. This wasn't just about survival. This wasn't just about one town or one gang. It was about the people who still believed in justice and right and wrong, and the fight that never ended, no matter how tired you got. "You've got the right spirit, Rachel," McAllister said, standing up and adjusting his hat. "But remember, this is a marathon, not a sprint. We can't afford to make mistakes." Rachel stood beside him, her eyes locked on the distant hills. "I understand. We'll be careful." McAllister gave a final nod, his hand resting on the pommel of his saddle. The group would leave at first light, just as planned. They had no time to waste. The Marauders were already making their move, and every second they waited put the people of Raven's Hollow in more danger. "I'll be ready," McAllister said quietly, as if to reassure himself more than anyone else. "Get some sleep. We'll need it." Rachel gave him a small, resolute smile and turned to join the others by the campfire, settling down under a blanket. McAllister remained standing for a moment longer, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon, where the last vestiges of daylight faded into darkness. He could feel it, an old, familiar feeling creeping up on him, the same feeling he had known when he was younger, when he had been chasing criminals and outlaws across the West. The battle was coming. He could feel it in his bones. McAllister didn't sleep much that night. He couldn't. Too many thoughts swirled in his mind, too many questions. Would the people of Raven's Hollow be able to hold their own once the fight began? Could they really stand up against the might of the Marauders and their corrupt allies? But there was one thing McAllister knew for sure. He wasn't going to let them take this land. Not while he still drew breath. And when dawn broke over the hills, McAllister and Rachel led the small band of fighters out of the camp and back onto the road, ready to confront the threat that loomed ahead. It wasn't just a fight for Raven's Hollow anymore. It was a fight for the heart of the West itself. And the old sheriff wasn't about to let anyone take it without a fight. The first rays of dawn stretched across the horizon, painting the sky with hues of pink and gold. The wind was sharp, cutting through the land, but the small group of riders pressed forward, the dust swirling beneath their horses' hooves as they made their way down the dirt trail. McAllister rode at the front, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. He wasn't sure what lay ahead, but he knew one thing for certain. This fight was far from over. If anything, it had only just begun. Behind him, Rachel rode alongside a few of the town's volunteers, men and women whose faces were hardened by hardship, but whose hearts still burned with a fire that had not yet been extinguished. Some were farmers, others were ranchers, and a few were lawmen who had refused to bend to the Marauders' will. They all had one thing in common: a belief that the land still belonged to the people who worked it, who lived on it, and who fought to protect it. McAllister had not seen this kind of unity in years. It was the kind of unity that could topple empires. As they rode, the landscape began to change. The wide, barren fields of Hollow Creek slowly gave way to the rocky hills and dense patches of brush that led toward Raven's Hollow. The closer they got, the more McAllister could feel the weight of what was ahead. The Marauders weren't just another gang. They were organized, ruthless, and backed by the money and power of those who wanted to reshape the land in their image. This wasn't just a fight for one town. It was a fight for the future of the West itself. Rachel's voice broke through his thoughts, low and steady. "We're almost there, Sheriff. Just a few more hours, and we'll be in Raven's Hollow." McAllister nodded, his gaze never leaving the trail ahead. "Stay alert. This isn't over. The Marauders will be expecting us, and they'll be ready." Rachel's face tightened, her eyes scanning the hills around them. She had seen enough to know that McAllister was right. They weren't just dealing with outlaws. They were dealing with an organized force that had power, resources, and an iron grip on the land. The more she thought about it, the more she realized just how dangerous this fight really was. But there was no turning back now. They were in this together, and there was no room for fear. As they pressed on, McAllister could see the smoke rising in the distance, faint but unmistakable. It came from Raven's Hollow. It wasn't an unusual sight. Most of the townspeople cooked their meals over open fires, but this was different. This smoke was too thick, too heavy. Something was burning. His heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just a sign of a fire. It was a sign of a town under siege. "We need to move faster," McAllister said. His voice clipped, the urgency creeping into his tone. "They're already here." Rachel turned her horse, spurring it forward. "We can't afford to wait. If we ride hard, we can still catch them off guard. We'll make it to the town before they have time to organize." McAllister didn't need to be told twice. He urged Patches forward, the horse's hooves pounding the earth with a speed that made the ground tremble beneath him. The group followed close behind, the sound of hooves and heavy breathing filling the air. As they neared the outskirts of Raven's Hollow, McAllister could see the devastation unfolding before them. The town was in chaos. Smoke billowed from several buildings, and the unmistakable sound of gunfire echoed in the distance. He could hear the shouts of men, the cries of women and children who were being driven from their homes. The marauders had already made their move. McAllister's hand went instinctively to his revolver, his mind sharp with focus. This wasn't just about fighting back anymore. This was about survival. The marauders had come to take everything, and if they weren't stopped now, there would be nothing left to save. Rachel's voice cut through the chaos, her tone fierce. "We can't just charge in. They've got the town surrounded. If we do this right, we can hit them where it hurts." McAllister nodded grimly. He didn't like the idea of waiting. He never had. But Rachel was right. They couldn't afford to rush in blindly. They needed strategy. They needed to take out the marauders' leaders and hit their supply lines before they could regroup. It wasn't just about stopping a gang of outlaws. It was about breaking the foundation of their power. "Split up," McAllister commanded. "We'll hit them from both sides. Move quietly. We don't want to give them a chance to regroup. Rachel, you and the others take the eastern side. I'll go around to the west. We'll draw them in and make sure they can't escape." Rachel gave him a firm nod. "Got it, Sheriff. Just don't do anything foolish. We need you alive." McAllister didn't respond. He didn't need to. They both knew what had to be done. With a final glance at the burning town, McAllister spurred Patches forward, his heart beating faster as the adrenaline surged through him. He could see the marauders now, large, menacing figures standing in the streets, their guns drawn, their faces obscured by dust and shadow. They were everywhere. But McAllister was faster, and he had something they didn't, the element of surprise. As he circled around to the west side of the town, he moved quietly, keeping to the shadows and out of sight. He could hear the marauders shouting commands to each other, unaware of the small band of fighters closing in. His mind was sharp, his senses heightened. This was what he had trained for. This was what he had spent his life doing. He took a deep breath and pressed forward. The fight was about to begin. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon when the chaos erupted. McAllister moved like a shadow through the streets of Raven's Hollow, his eyes darting from building to building, his every sense alert. He knew that Rachel and the others were already in position on the other side of town, waiting for his signal to strike. He felt the weight of the revolver at his side, the familiar chill of the metal, the comforting weight of the weapon that had seen countless duels and battles in its time. This was his world, the quick draw, the calculated shot, the high-stakes game of life and death. And it was a game that he had mastered. He wasn't about to let it slip away. McAllister crept along the alleyway that ran parallel to the main street, his steps light and deliberate. The town was eerily quiet except for the occasional shout or clatter of hooves as the marauders moved about. The air was thick with the smoke from burning buildings, the acrid scent of it burning McAllister's nostrils. But he pressed on, moving closer to the heart of the marauders' position. Through the haze of smoke and dust, he saw them. A group of marauders, huddled near a small building on the corner, shouting orders at each other. They hadn't seen him yet. McAllister's pulse quickened, but his breathing remained steady. He had the element of surprise on his side, and he wasn't about to waste it. He crouched low, his hands steady on the grip of his revolver. He counted them, 4 marauders, standing close together. A perfect opportunity. McAllister waited, his patience like a tight coil, winding tighter with every passing second. The marauders' voices grew louder, their attention focused on the chaos unfolding elsewhere in the town. They were distracted, unaware of the storm that was about to hit them. Suddenly, McAllister's eyes locked onto the closest marauder, a man who was shouting something to the others, his back turned. McAllister's hand moved with the precision of a snake striking, drawing his revolver in a blur of motion. The gun roared, and the first marauder fell, his body jerking violently before hitting the ground with a sickening thud. The remaining 3 marauders scrambled, their hands reaching for their guns, but McAllister was already moving. His second shot rang out, striking the second marauder in the chest, sending him stumbling back. McAllister didn't wait for the others to react. He was already on the move, darting to the side, using the cover of the buildings and alleys to keep himself out of their line of sight. The 2 remaining marauders were disoriented, scrambling for their weapons, but McAllister was too fast. He moved like a shadow, always one step ahead, his gun never wavering. The third marauder never had a chance to raise his revolver before McAllister's shot rang out, striking him in the leg and sending him crashing to the ground in a heap. The last marauder stood frozen, his eyes wide with fear as McAllister's gun was aimed squarely at his chest. There was no hesitation in McAllister's gaze, no mercy. The marauder could see it in the old sheriff's eyes, the quiet, unwavering certainty of a man who had seen too much and lost too much to ever be swayed by pity. "You're done," McAllister said coldly, his voice low, but filled with authority. "The marauders are finished here." The marauder's hands trembled, his revolver still raised, but his fingers were too weak to pull the trigger. He had lost. The town had already spoken. McAllister didn't wait for the man to lower his weapon. He fired once more, the sound of the bullet echoing in the narrow alleyway. The last marauder collapsed, his body crumpling to the ground. McAllister stood over the fallen men, his chest rising and falling as he holstered his revolver, the familiar weight settling into his side. He hadn't killed all of them. He hadn't needed to. They had come for the people of Raven's Hollow, but the people weren't as weak as they had thought, and McAllister had shown them that, even in the face of a seemingly unstoppable force, there were men, good men, who would rise up and fight. "Sheriff," Rachel's voice came from the direction of the main street, sharp with urgency. "They're regrouping. We need to move fast." McAllister didn't hesitate. He turned quickly, moving back toward the street, where the sound of battle still raged. He had put down the Marauder's scout, but there were still plenty more to deal with. The people of Raven's Hollow had the will to fight, but McAllister knew that they couldn't do it alone. The Marauders were relentless, and they wouldn't stop until they had everything. He mounted Patches quickly, Rachel riding up beside him. "We'll need to push them back, or they'll come after us full force. We can't afford to wait for them to organize again." McAllister nodded. "Get the others. We're going in. It's time to end this." The group rode into the town center, where the sound of gunfire was thick in the air, the smoke from burning buildings swirling around them. The Marauders had fortified their position, but McAllister could already see the cracks beginning to show. They had underestimated the people of Raven's Hollow, and they had certainly underestimated the old sheriff. Rachel called out to the others, rallying them with words that carried more weight than any weapon could. McAllister joined in, leading the charge with his revolver in hand. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about taking the town back, about showing these marauders that they were no longer welcome here. The battle that followed was brutal. McAllister and Rachel fought side by side, their weapons flashing in the smoke-filled streets as they pushed the marauders back. The townspeople, galvanized by McAllister's leadership, fought with a fury and determination that only came from knowing they had nothing left to lose. But the marauders were still strong, still dangerous. McAllister knew that this fight wasn't over yet. They had driven the marauders out of the town center, but the real battle was yet to come. "We need to finish this," McAllister said to Rachel, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the street. "We take their leader. We take down the head, and the body will fall." Rachel's eyes flashed with understanding. "Then let's make sure we're ready. We won't let them get away." McAllister mounted his horse once more, his eyes set with determination. The old sheriff had lived a life of violence and hard choices, but he wasn't done yet. The marauders thought they could break this town, thought they could destroy it. They were wrong, and now they were going to find out just how wrong they were. The air around Raven's Hollow seemed to thicken, the smoke from the burning buildings mixing with the heavy scent of gunpowder that lingered in the streets. McAllister and Rachel stood at the edge of the town center, surveying the wreckage. The battle had shifted in their favor, momentarily, but the marauders weren't defeated. They had been pushed back for now, but McAllister knew the worst was yet to come. "They're gathering," McAllister muttered, his eyes narrowing as he watched the remnants of the marauder group regroup in the distance. They were trying to make a stand near the town's old warehouse, the place where the marauders had likely been hiding their supplies. That was their last stronghold, and it would take everything McAllister and Rachel had to end it. Rachel turned to McAllister, her face set in a grim expression. "We need to hit them before they can reinforce." If they fortify there, we're done for. McAllister nodded, his gaze flickering over the town. He had seen enough to know that Raven's Hollow was on the edge of destruction. It wasn't just about fighting for the town anymore. This was about reclaiming control of the West from the forces that had turned it into a place where only the strong survived. The Marauders were a symptom of a larger illness, one that had taken root across the land. The time for hesitation had passed. They couldn't wait for reinforcements or for a perfect opportunity. The time for action was now. We hit them hard and fast, McAllister said, his voice steady. No more holding back. We take the warehouse. We take the leader. And we end this. Rachel's eyes burned with determination. Let's do it. McAllister turned to the small group of fighters who had come with them, their faces weary but resolute. The townspeople had fought bravely, but this would be the final test. If they wanted to reclaim their home, they would need to fight like they had nothing left to lose. Because, in truth, they didn't. We move out in 10 minutes, McAllister commanded, his voice sharp. Don't get sloppy. The Marauders are ruthless. They won't hesitate to put you down if you give them the chance. The group nodded, and McAllister could feel the tension in the air as everyone mounted their horses and prepared for the final push. The town of Raven's Hollow, what was left of it, stood as the last battlefield in a war that had already claimed too many lives. McAllister knew the risks. The Marauders had the numbers, and they had the firepower. But McAllister had something they didn't. The knowledge that the people of this town were ready to fight for something worth dying for. The group set out, moving swiftly and silently toward the warehouse where the Marauders had taken their stand. McAllister led the charge, his revolver steady in his holster, his mind running through the plan he had formulated. They would make their way around the back of the building, cut off their escape routes, and then converge on the front. The leader, Axton Ironhand Blake, was sure to be in the thick of things. And McAllister knew that taking down Axton would break the Marauders' resolve. Without their leader, they would scatter. Rachel rode close beside McAllister, her eyes scanning every shadow, every movement in the distance. The group moved like a well-oiled machine, slipping through the streets with purpose and determination. As they neared the warehouse, McAllister signaled for them to halt. He dismounted quickly, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. "Rachel," he said in a low voice, "you take the eastern side. I'll take the west. We hit them from both sides and push in." Rachel gave a curt nod. "Understood. Just be careful." McAllister didn't respond. He didn't need to. They both knew the stakes. The time for caution had passed. With a final glance at his group, McAllister moved toward the west side of the warehouse, keeping to the shadows. He could hear the faint murmur of voices, the clinking of metal, and the sound of boots scraping against the ground. The Marauders were inside, preparing for a fight they thought they could win. McAllister's heart beat steady in his chest, his senses sharp. As he rounded the corner, he saw them, two Marauders standing guard near the back entrance, their backs turned. The sound of their laughter was cut short as McAllister's revolver flashed into action. The first shot rang out, and one of the men dropped, clutching his chest before crumpling to the ground. The second man reached for his gun, but McAllister was already on him. His shot was quick, precise, just like always, and the Marauder was down before he even had a chance to pull the trigger. McAllister moved swiftly, making his way toward the entrance, where Rachel was already waiting. They didn't speak. There was no need for words. They were past that. This was the final stretch, the point of no return. Inside the warehouse, the chaos had already begun. The sound of gunfire echoed through the building as the rest of the group moved in, taking down Marauder after Marauder. McAllister moved with the precision of a man who had spent years in the field, picking off the Marauders one by one, clearing the path toward the center of the warehouse, where Axton Blake was holed up. He could hear Blake's voice, gruff and commanding, barking orders to his men. McAllister moved closer, his heart steady, his breath calm. He knew the man. He knew Blake's reputation. Axton Ironhand Blake was a beast of a man. Tall, with a face scarred from years of violence and a reputation that made even the hardest men hesitate. But McAllister wasn't afraid. He had faced men like Blake before, and he knew exactly how to handle them. Rachel moved in from the opposite side, her pistol drawn, her eyes focused on the prize. McAllister could feel her presence as they neared the heart of the fight. They were close now, so close. And then, in the thick of the chaos, McAllister saw him. Axton Blake, standing in the center of the room, his revolver in hand, his eyes narrowing as he saw McAllister approach. A sick smile spread across Blake's face, a grin full of menace. So, the old sheriff finally decided to show up. Blake sneered, his voice thick with mockery. "You think you can stop me, old man? You think you can take me down?" McAllister didn't respond. His gun was already drawn, his aim steady. "You're done, Blake," McAllister said coldly. "This ends here." Blake's eyes flashed with anger, and he drew his revolver in a blur of motion. But McAllister was faster. The old sheriff's gun barked, and Blake's gun flew from his hand, crashing to the floor as his body jerked back in shock. McAllister advanced slowly, his eyes locked on Blake, the revolver still aimed at his chest. The Marauder leader's arrogance was gone now, replaced by something more primal, fear. "This is over," McAllister said, his voice filled with finality. Blake didn't respond. He didn't have to. McAllister pulled the trigger one last time, and the Marauder leader fell, his body crumpling to the ground. The fight was over. The people of Raven's Hollow had fought for their freedom, and they had won. The smoke still lingered in the air as the last echoes of gunfire faded into silence. The once bustling town of Raven's Hollow, now scarred and battered, stood in the wake of the brutal fight. The streets were littered with debris, and the smell of burning wood and gunpowder hung heavy in the air. But the worst of it was over. The Marauders had been beaten back, their leader taken down, their empire shattered in one swift, decisive blow. McAllister stood in the middle of the warehouse, his revolver still in his hand, though he had long since lowered it. He wasn't sure what he felt. The adrenaline that had fueled him through the fight was starting to wear off, and the weight of the battle, of the deaths that had been required to win it, began to sink in. His eyes scanned the room, looking at the bodies of the Marauders who had been taken down. He didn't take pleasure in it, not anymore. But the fight had to be fought, and he had done what needed to be done. Rachel approached from the shadows, her face smudged with dirt, her eyes tired but resolute. "We did it," she said, her voice hoarse from the dust and smoke. "They're gone. We're free." McAllister didn't respond immediately. He simply nodded, his gaze distant as he took in the destruction around them. He could hear the sound of the townspeople moving through the streets, cautiously emerging from hiding, unsure of what they would find. The fear that had once gripped Raven's Hollow was beginning to lift, but it was replaced by something else, uncertainty. "I guess this is it, then," McAllister said softly, his voice carrying the weight of the years. "We've won, but at what cost?" Rachel looked at him for a moment, her brow furrowing slightly. "What do you mean?" McAllister turned to face her, his eyes hardening as he spoke. "Look around. This town's been torn apart. People are dead. This victory, it doesn't come without a price. And no matter how much we try to rebuild, the damage has been done. The Marauders may be gone, but what about the people who are left? What about the lives that were lost?" Rachel stepped closer, her expression softening. "We did what we had to do. You didn't do this alone, Sheriff. The people of this town fought beside you. They're the ones who stood up against the Marauders. And now, we've got a chance to rebuild, to make something better out of this." McAllister shook his head slowly, his hand still resting on the worn handle of his revolver. "It's not that simple. They didn't just come for Raven's Hollow. They came for everything we fought for. And it's going to take more than a few good people to fix what's been broken." Rachel's eyes flashed with determination. "Maybe, but we've got a chance now. We've got a chance to make sure that people like the Marauders, people who think they can take whatever they want, never get to do this again." McAllister looked at her, his lips pressing into a thin line. There was a fire in her eyes that he hadn't seen in years, a fire that reminded him of the old days, the days when he had fought for justice, for the people who had nowhere else to turn. "You're right," McAllister said finally, his voice low. "It's just, I've seen too much, Rachel. I've watched too many people die for causes that didn't mean anything in the end. I'm tired of seeing it." Rachel placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch gentle but firm. "You don't have to carry it all on your own, Sheriff." "Not anymore." McAllister's gaze softened, and for a moment, he simply stood there, the weight of everything they had just been through settling on his shoulders. It was true. He didn't have to carry the burden alone. And maybe that was the hardest thing to accept, that he didn't have to do it all himself anymore. "I've been running from this for too long," McAllister said quietly. "But I think you're right. We've got something worth fighting for. And maybe, for the first time in a long while, it's worth sticking around to see what comes next." Rachel smiled, a sense of relief washing over her. "Then let's make sure the people of Raven's Hollow get what they deserve." As the townspeople began to gather in the streets, some of them cautiously walking toward the center of the town, McAllister couldn't help but feel a sense of hope, tempered by the reality of what they had just endured. The battle was over, and the Marauders were gone. But the road ahead would not be easy. The town would have to rebuild, the scars would take time to heal, and there would always be more threats lurking in the shadows. But for the first time in years, McAllister felt the stirrings of something he hadn't felt in a long time. The urge to fight again. The old sheriff wasn't done yet, and neither was Raven's Hollow. The people gathered around McAllister and Rachel, their faces filled with gratitude, but also with the tiredness of those who had been through too much. It wasn't over yet. The fight for their land, their freedom, would continue. But now, for the first time in years, there was a glimmer of something different. A sense of unity, of community. McAllister surveyed the crowd, his eyes settling on the familiar faces of the townspeople who had risked everything to fight back. And in that moment, as the last remnants of the Marauders scattered in the distance, McAllister knew one thing for certain. Raven's Hollow wasn't just a town anymore. It was a symbol of defiance, a symbol of hope, a symbol that, even in the darkest of times, the people would rise up to fight for what was right. And McAllister, the old sheriff, would be there with them every step of the way. If you enjoyed this story, please leave your comment below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel where your support means the world to us. We look forward to bringing you more content that inspires growth, joy, and purpose. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.